The war had ended in 1971, but 3 Indian Air Force pilots were still being held prisoner at a POW camp in Rawalpindi, Pakistan. As usual, the prison guards were making their rounds, delivering food to the prisoners in each cell. It was August 13th, 1972. The time was 11 p.m. When the guards reached cell number 4, they made a shocking discovery. The 3 prisoners inside the cell were gone. The guards immediately began searching for them, and then they noticed something. A large hole had been cut into the wall of the cell. At that point, there was no doubt. The 3 prisoners had escaped through that hole. And here's what makes this story remarkable. All 3 of them were Indian Air Force pilots. But how did these Indian Air Force pilots end up as prisoners inside a Pakistani jail? And how did they manage to outsmart the guards and escape from one of Pakistan's most heavily guarded prisons? And most importantly, did they ever make it back home? In today's video, I'm going to tell you exactly how 3 Indian Air Force pilots managed to escape from a Pakistani prison. This story is incredibly interesting, so make sure you watch until the very end. And if you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe. The war between India and Pakistan was underway. At the time, East Pakistan was fighting for independence. Several Indian Air Force pilots were carrying out missions over western Pakistan. On December 10, 1971, Pakistan launched a series of attacks on Indian airfields, and that marked the beginning of a devastating war between the 2 countries. During the war, the Indian Army and Navy had effectively destroyed Pakistan's military forces, but the Pakistani Air Force was still fighting against the Indian Air Force. They were carrying out heavy bombing raids across different parts of western India. A radar tower in Jafarwal, Lahore, was helping Pakistan direct its Air Force operations. At the same time, whenever an Indian aircraft entered Pakistani airspace, the tower allowed Pakistan to track its coordinates. If India wanted to gain the upper hand, this tower had to be destroyed. And for this mission, one of the Indian Air Force's most powerful units was chosen, the 26th Squadron. That day, 6 Sukhoi 7 fighter jets took off from Adhampur Air Base in Punjab with one mission: to destroy the Jafarwal Tower. One of those fighter jets was flown by Flight Lieutenant Dilip Parulkar. Before long, Dilip's fighter jet entered Pakistani territory, but before he could attack the tower, a Pakistani anti-aircraft missile struck his aircraft. His Sukhoi 7 had been hit while flying over Pakistani airspace. Dilip immediately ejected from the aircraft to save his life, but unfortunately, he landed in a village inside Pakistan. As soon as the villagers saw an Indian pilot coming down, they rushed toward him. They began beating Dilip. The attack left him almost unconscious. When the Pakistan army arrived, they took the injured pilot into custody. When Dilip regained consciousness, he realized that he had been captured by the Pakistani army, and sitting right in front of him was a Pakistani commander, and point out what was located where. He wanted to extract military intelligence from Dilip, but even after being captured, this brave Indian officer refused to betray his country. Instead, he decided to fool the enemy. When the Pakistani commanders realized that Dilip was deliberately giving them false information, they subjected him to further abuse. But even after severe punishment, Dilip refused to give in. The next day, the Pakistani army continued trying different ways to get information about Indian airfields from him. At first, they tried to tempt him with various offers, but when that didn't work, they began abusing him again. He was barely allowed to eat or sleep in the prison. One Pakistani military officer even subjected him to constant mental harassment, and within a few days, Dilip was transferred from Lahore to a prison in Rawalpindi. Rawalpindi was home to one of Pakistan's most heavily guarded prisons. A total of 12 Indian Air Force pilots were being held there. All of them had been captured by the Pakistani military in one way or another during the 1971 war. But there's one important part of this story we shouldn't forget. In 1971, with India's military support, East Pakistan fought for its independence and emerged as a new nation, Bangladesh. If you want to learn more about how this historic war unfolded, there's already a video about it right here on this channel. But for now, let's get back to our main story. There, Dilip met several of his fellow officers, including Squadron Leader D.S. Jaffa and Flight Lieutenant Malvinder Singh Grewal. They too had previously suffered various forms of abuse at the hands of Pakistani forces. 3 days went by. After everything he had been through, Dilip Parulkar began thinking about a way to escape from the prison. However, not every member of the Pakistani military treated the prisoners badly. The officer in charge of the Rawalpindi prison, Usman Hamid, always treated the Indian pilots with respect. The reason was simple. They weren't criminals. They were prisoners of war. But some of the other prison guards disliked Hamid because of the way he treated the Indian pilots. Hamid, however, didn't let that bother him. To help the prisoners deal with their isolation, he gave each of them an Indian music cassette player and a map. And those maps would eventually play a crucial role in helping the pilots escape from the prison. And that escape plan is exactly what I'm going to tell you about next. Among the pilots being held in the prison at the time, several were Christians. On December 25, 1971, Hamid organized a tea and cake party for the Christian prisoners. And it was during this party that Dilip learned something for the first time. India had won the 1971 war, and in Dhaka, Bangladesh, 93,000 Pakistani soldiers had surrendered to the Indian army. The moment the Indian pilots heard the news, they were filled with joy. But they also took a moment to remember the Indian soldiers who had lost their lives in the war. They observed 2 minutes of silence in their honor. Now, with nearly 93,000 Pakistani soldiers having surrendered, the pilots hoped that the Indian government would soon bring the Indian prisoners home. But Dilip Parulkar wasn't convinced. He knew that even though India had won the war, a prisoner exchange between the two countries could still take a long time, and Dilip didn't want to spend all that time sitting in a Pakistani prison. So he made a decision. He was going to escape from Rawalpindi prison. At first, when he presented the idea to the other pilots, they rejected it. They still had faith in the Indian government. But then, several more months passed, and there was still no agreement between India and Pakistan about bringing the prisoners of war home. That's when Dilip brought up the idea of escaping again. And this time, 2 Air Force officers agreed to join him. They were Flight Lieutenant Malvinder Singh Grewal and Flying Officer Harish Singhji. And from that moment on, the 3 pilots began planning their escape. But escaping from a high-security prison like Rawalpindi was anything but easy. The walls of the cells where the prisoners were held were around 18 inches thick. And the prison had a 3-layer security system. The first layer was right outside each prisoner's cell. Guards were posted there to keep watch over the prisoners. The second layer was positioned farther away from the cells. Pakistani soldiers were stationed at specific points. Their job was to check everything entering the prison each day. They also checked who was coming to meet the prisoners. And then came the third layer. This was the most heavily secured part of the prison. Guards were stationed throughout the prison compound, including at every block and major intersection. There were also several watchtowers. From those towers, Pakistani soldiers could keep an eye on the entire prison compound. And surrounding the prison were high walls topped with barbed wire. Anyone who managed to get over those walls could be shot on sight. So escaping from this prison was almost like walking straight into death. But the Indian Air Force officers were so smart. They started looking for a weakness in the security system. They noticed something important. While in prison, the prisoners were allowed to use the bathroom at specific times. And whenever a prisoner went to the bathroom, a Pakistani soldier escorted him there. The same guard would then bring him back. At first, Dilip came up with a plan. He thought they could take one of these guards hostage and use him to escape. But there was a huge problem. Taking a guard hostage and escaping from a prison this large would be extremely risky. So the 3 pilots, Harish, Malvinder, and Dilip, turned their attention to something else. The atlas map that the prison officer, Usman Hamid, had given them. They carefully studied the map, and they noticed something interesting. If they followed the road outside the prison for some distance, they could reach the Grand Trunk Road. One direction led toward Lahore, a city near the Indian border. The other direction led toward Peshawar, near the Afghan border. But there was a problem. After the war, Pakistan had placed its borders on high alert. That made reaching Indian territory directly from the prison extremely difficult. So the 3 pilots came up with another plan. They would cross Pakistan and make their way to Peshawar. Once they reached Peshawar, they would contact the Indian embassy, and from there, they hoped to find a way back to India. Their destination was decided, but there was still one major problem. They first had to get out of one of Pakistan's most heavily guarded prisons. During their trips to the bathroom, the three pilots had noticed something else. Right outside the building, there was a road, and that road led toward another building next to the prison. That building was a Pakistan Air Force data center, and running along that road was the prison's high outer wall. Now, the three pilots came up with a new idea. They needed to move into a cell located as close as possible to the edge of the prison compound, a cell where security was relatively weaker, and for that, they chose cell number 4.
Dilip Parulkar already knew some of the prison guards. He managed to convince them to move him into cell number 4, along with Harish and Malvinder. But there was one more Indian pilot already being held in that cell. His name was Vidyadhar Shankar Chatti. He didn't try to escape from the prison himself, but he helped the three pilots in every way he could. And once they moved into the cell, the real work began. They started digging a tunnel through the prison wall. But creating a tunnel without any proper tools, while keeping it hidden from the guards, was anything but easy. So they had to use their common sense. First, they deliberately let their hair and beards grow longer. Then, they asked prison officer Usman Hamid for a pair of scissors so they could cut their hair and beards. But they needed something else. At the time, a young boy would occasionally come to the prison and bring tea and cold drinks for the prisoners of war. To open the caps of the cold drinks, the boy used a small metal key, and the three pilots managed to trick the boy into giving them the key. That simple little object would soon become an important tool in their escape plan.
Under the Geneva Conventions, the Red Cross provided Indian prisoners of war held in Pakistan with essential supplies, including medicines, winter clothing, and other relief materials. The prisoners also received a monthly allowance. Dilip Parulkar had been saving some of that money for months. At the time, Dilip Parulkar, Malvinder Singh, and Harish Singh were secretly planning an escape. Another prisoner, Vidyadhar Chatti, also played an important role in helping them with their plan. By the last week of April, they had begun digging a tunnel from inside the prison. They had very few tools, so they used whatever small objects they could get their hands on, including spoons and other pieces of metal, to slowly dig through the wall and the ground beneath it. Every night, they worked in secret. One of them would go down into the tunnel and work, while the others would pull their blankets over themselves and pretend to be asleep. The idea was simple. If a guard looked into their cell, it would appear as though all of them were sleeping normally. But there was another problem: noise. Every time they broke through bricks, plaster, or mortar, the sound could potentially alert the guards. So they often turned up the volume of their radio at night, hoping the music and other sounds would cover the noise coming from the tunnel. Day after day, they slowly removed pieces of brick, plaster, and mortar from the prison wall. But hiding the material they removed was another challenge. They had to find ways to secretly dispose of it, or keep it hidden so that the guards would not notice anything unusual. Then, they faced another major problem: the light. According to prison rules, the light inside the cells had to remain on throughout the night, even after the prisoners had gone to sleep. That made it extremely difficult to work inside the tunnel. Eventually, Dilip and Malvinder managed to disable the bulb by damaging its fuse. At that time, replacing a damaged bulb could take several days. This gave the prisoners the darkness they needed, and under the cover of darkness, they continued digging. But one night, their entire plan almost collapsed. Malvinder was working inside the tunnel. Meanwhile, Dilip, Harish, and Vidyadhar were lying on their beds, pretending to be asleep. Suddenly, a prison guard looked inside the cell. Even in the darkness, he realized that one of the 4 prisoners was missing. The guard immediately went to report it to the officer in charge. But before the officers could arrive, the others gave Malvinder a signal. He quickly climbed out of the tunnel and returned to his bed. Moments later, the officer arrived with the guard and inspected the cell. But when they looked inside, all 4 prisoners were lying on their beds. Everyone appeared to be asleep. The officer ended up becoming angry with the guard for raising a false alarm. And just like that, the prisoners escaped discovery. For weeks, they continued their secret work. Eventually, the tunnel reached close to the outer compound of the prison. Only one thin layer of plaster remained between them and freedom. They decided that when the time came to escape, they would break through that final layer and get outside. But they were not thinking only about getting out of the prison. They also had to survive once they were outside. So they prepared an improvised compass. They took sewing needles that had been given to them for repairing their clothes and magnetized them using a radio battery. The magnetized needle could then be used to determine direction. They also began collecting some dry food that they could carry during the journey. Dilip's family had also managed to send him some clothing through the Red Cross. The clothes were then prepared for use during their escape. Everything was slowly coming together. Now, they needed the right moment.
The prisoners initially planned to escape around August 14, the day Pakistan celebrated its independence. They believed that security personnel might be occupied with other duties, creating an opportunity to escape. But then, on the night of August 13, 1972, something completely unexpected happened. A powerful storm hit Rawalpindi. The wind and rain became so intense that guards stationed outside the compound moved inside the buildings for safety. The three prisoners immediately realized that this might be their best opportunity. That night, Dilip Parulkar, Malvinder Singh, and Harish Singh said goodbye to Vidyadhar Chatti. Then they entered the tunnel. They carried an improvised compass, a map, and some dry food with them. After crawling through the tunnel, they finally reached the last barrier. Dilip broke through the plaster. They were outside. But their danger was far from over. A guard was positioned on the opposite side of the area where they were trying to escape. If they had come out at the wrong moment, they could have been caught immediately. Then the rain became even heavier.
Because of the storm, the guard left his position and moved toward an Air Force building. At the same time, the prison watchtowers were largely deserted because of the severe weather. The three men seized the opportunity. They emerged from the tunnel and moved toward the prison corridor. On one side was a massive prison wall. Dilip took the cloth rope they had prepared and threw it over the wall. Fortunately, it caught on the fencing. One after another, Dilip, Malvinder, and Harish climbed over the wall. After nearly 9 months in captivity, the three men were finally outside the prison. For the first time in months, they were standing under the open sky. Despite the heavy rain, the three men began walking along the Grand Trunk Road. After some time, they saw a bus standing by the side of the road. The bus was heading toward Peshawar. They climbed aboard. After a while, the conductor approached them and asked for their fare in Urdu, but none of the three men spoke Urdu well, so they remained silent. The conductor then tried speaking to them in broken English. This time, they paid the fare with the money they had carefully saved during their months in prison, but their behavior was already attracting attention. Some of the passengers began looking at them suspiciously. The next morning, around 7 o'clock, the bus reached Peshawar. Now the three men needed to hide their real identities. They adopted false identities and tried to appear like ordinary travelers. From Peshawar, they continued toward Jamrud. Their ultimate destination was the Torkham border on the Afghanistan-Pakistan frontier. If they could cross into Afghanistan, they would be much safer from the Pakistani military. But by this time, back at Rawalpindi prison, chaos had already begun. 3 Indian prisoners of war had escaped from one of the most heavily guarded prisons in Pakistan. For the Pakistani authorities, it was a major embarrassment. Meanwhile, the 3 escaped pilots were still trying to find their way toward Afghanistan. From Jamrud, they traveled by bus toward Landi Kotal. The Torkham border was only a few kilometers away, but there was a problem. None of the 3 men knew the exact route to Torkham. Then, Harish noticed something on their old map. Near the Torkham border, the map showed a railway station called Landi Khana. They thought the railway station could help them find their way toward the border. So after reaching Landi Kotal, they began asking local people for directions to Landi Kana railway station. But no one seemed to know what they were talking about. There was a reason for that. The map they were using was outdated. Landi Kana railway station had been closed decades earlier. The three men had no idea that this old map would eventually destroy their escape plan. As they continued asking villagers about the station, one person became suspicious. He asked them a simple question: "Who are you? And where are you going?" The three men could not give a convincing answer. They were eventually taken to a nearby police station. Dilip and Harish tried to explain that they were Pakistani Air Force pilots who were simply traveling around the area, but their appearance, behavior, and answers only increased the officer's suspicions. By then, news of the three escaped Indian POWs had spread across Pakistan. It did not take long for the authorities to connect the dots. The police realized that these three men were almost certainly the prisoners who had escaped from Rawalpindi prison. Soon, Pakistani military personnel arrived and took them back into custody. Their attempt to reach Afghanistan had failed. They had come incredibly close to freedom, but they were caught only a few kilometers from the border. The three pilots were punished with 30 days of solitary confinement. Under different circumstances, the authorities might have treated them even more harshly, but Pakistan was still holding a large number of Indian prisoners of war. Any serious mistreatment of the three men could have created further consequences. So the Pakistani authorities decided not to keep them at Rawalpindi. They were eventually transferred, along with other Indian POWs, to a prisoner of war camp in Faisalabad. Hundreds of other Indian prisoners were being held there as well. Meanwhile, India and Pakistan were negotiating the repatriation and exchange of prisoners of war. Eventually, an agreement was reached. In December 1972, Dilip Parulkar, Malvinder Singh, Harish Singh, and other Indian prisoners of war were finally released and returned to India. When they crossed back into India through the Wagah border, large crowds gathered to welcome them. They had failed to reach Afghanistan. They had been captured again. But their escape attempt had already become an extraordinary chapter in the history of the 1971 war. What did you think of this incredible escape story? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit the like button. And for more incredible true stories and fascinating moments from history, subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next video.